Hey everyone, Tim from Chamferzone here. Welcome to the Introduction to Blender tutorial. This tutorial already released a few months ago and it's a free tutorial, so you can watch it on YouTube. And in case you already did watch it, of course there's no reason to do that again. But for everyone else, I just wanted to include it so that you get a chance to also familiarize yourself with the fundamentals of Blender, especially if you're completely new to it. So we're going to cover things such as plugins, modifiers, tools, as well as a few shortcuts that I changed. And speaking of shortcuts, if you want, you can load my shortcut file. That way you have QWER, change to select, move, rotate, and scale. And I also put extrude on the F button. So these are pretty much the only changes that I did. Also on F4, we have the wireframe toggle. And that just makes it a bit more easier for me to work with because I'm coming from 3D Max. And this is sort of similar to what we have there. So if you want, you can use these shortcuts. But also I go over it here in the fundamentals course, so you get to see everything that I changed there. And then speaking of plugins, if you watch this tutorial, you will get to the part where I explain the QBlocker plugin. This plugin is no longer needed because it's now built into Blender, so we have the exact same functionality and there's no need to install this plugin anymore. So this will be a good base for anyone completely new. Everyone else, you can just skip it and we start with the revolver. But a lot of time went into the creation of this fundamentals course, and that's why I also wanted to include it here to the revolver package. So with that said, let's get started. Happy modeling and cheers! Hey guys, welcome to Blender. The first thing people usually do is press the middle mouse wheel button and just pan around a bit. That already gives you a bit of a feeling here for the viewport. So before we start, I'm gonna activate a plugin that allows you to see what I'm doing. If you click here on this little arrow that sticks out there, you can also access that by pressing the N key. You get this sidebar menu here. This is where we get to see our transform information, which by the way, corresponds to the currently selected element, and also other things here such as tool, view, and most importantly our installed plugins will always appear here. And you don't have this plugin, you also won't need it. I just installed it so that here at the bottom you will now be able to see what mouse button I pressed and also which keyboard button, so that makes it easy for you to follow what I'm doing here. So while we're at it, let's talk about basic navigation here in Blender. I'm gonna bring up the edit preference window because if we talk about navigation, we also need to have a look here at our key maps. And if you go over here, you can change it to industry compatible, which will then make Blender behave more like you're used to it from 3D Max or from Maya. And that might be something that you can try. For me personally, I decided to just go with the default Blender settings because I figured that if I need to look something up, there's a lot of tutorials out there where it's just the standard key maps that were originally intended that way from Blender. And that just makes it easier then to quickly look something up. As you can see, I already have my own shortcut file here, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just gonna have the Blender settings and then I'm gonna change a few shortcuts where I think it makes sense. So this preference window, we're gonna get back to it very soon, so we can always have it in the background. Let's just take a look now at basic navigation. Pressing down the middle mouse wheel button while having an active selection such as this box here will enable us to circle around it. Mouse wheel lets you zoom in and out, and then pressing the shift key lets us pan around like this. And now let's say we have this object here unselected by clicking anywhere here in the viewport, and we are somewhere all the way out here. Now, if we select this box again here, you can press then the period key on the numpad to zoom right back to it. So let's take a look at our different view modes, which are perspective and ortho view, same as in any other 3D software. And you can see here, this icon already indicates that we are in the perspective view. And like it says there, if you press the numpad 5 key, you can toggle between perspective and ortho view. So there is one important thing that needs to be mentioned. First of all, on the numpad keys, we can quickly toggle through different kinds of views here. It will always tell you here on the upper left which view you're in. So for example, numpad 1 is the front view, 7 is the top view, 9 is bottom, 3 is right, and so on. So now if you use the mouse wheel button and get out of that, it will then go back to the perspective view, which is rather annoying. So in order to prevent that, we have to go back here to our preferences, and then under navigation, we want to disable auto perspective. So with that done, if we switch back here to our ortho view, we can now always remain in the ortho view unless we press the numpad 5 key again here to switch to perspective if you need it. There's also another way that we can toggle through these different modes that are on the numpad keys as well by pressing the Alt key. So it's kind of similar to ZBrush, where it will automatically then snap into the nearest view here, such as now we're in the back view, now we're at the top, and so on. So that is another very fast way that we can always snap here. And that means you don't always have to press the numpad keys, even though that's something that I like to do, because that way I always know I'm in the left view or the front view. And it's just a convenient thing where I don't always have to check where I'm currently at here in my 3D view. But regardless, it's a useful thing to be able to snap. So by default, we are in the object mode. The object mode is where we can create new solid geometry here. And let's, for example, add something by pressing Shift A, which will bring up this window here. And then let's add a cylinder here to our scene. Now you can see that it will always spawn that cylinder here at XYZ 0 axis, right at the center. And then let's say we want to take this out here, out of this box. We can then go over here to move and push it wherever we want to have it. Let's add something else. Let's have another cube here. There we go. And you will then see that it will add these things here into our currently selected collection. So this is basically our folder that we have active and where everything is in right now. Another thing that by default always comes with a new scene here are these lights, or I should say this one light and this camera here. By pressing Shift, we can select them together, and then pressing X will enable us to delete it. Usually we don't need that for modeling. So now you can see we only have geometry left here in this collection folder. But to be able to actually edit these cubes here, or let's say the cylinder, let's select this one, we have to switch over to our editing mode. So pressing Tab will get you there. And you see here we have all these extra buttons now, inset, extrude, bevel, all these things that we actually need to properly edit this geometry here. So since we are in a new mode, we are back into perspective. I'm going to press numpad 5 to get back into the ortho view. We are by default in this layout mode here. If we go over here to modeling mode, we have more screen space because it gets rid of this animation bar. And as long as we're not animating anything, it's probably best to have the maximum screen space. And if we switch over here to our object mode, it will also maintain this modeling view here. So once again, because now we are in this new mode here, gotta tell Blender that we also want to have the ortho view here. I'm gonna press Shift here on these objects, press X and delete them. And then while we are in object mode, let's create a new cylinder. So whenever we create new solid geometry in Blender, you will see here at the bottom left, we can expand this here into a window where then we have further control over how we want this cylinder here, in that case, to look like. We can also change the radius and the depth. And if you're coming from 3D Max, then there is one thing to notice that is different in Blender. So let's say we take this here and we want to move this object. Then take a look what happens here to this property window. Now we let go and our property window is gone. And this is a bit of a, I would say, more destructive workflow than in 3D Max, where we are still able to edit our properties even if we move it around somewhere. And in Blender, this means we are now basically stuck with this cylinder. And if we wanted to go back and change the sides on that, like right now we have 64, we want it to be 32 again, we have to delete it. And then we have to create a new cylinder. It will always remember the last settings that we made. So that makes it a little bit easier, but it will always center it here at XYZ 0, right there in the center. So that would be the perfect time to take a look at some free plugins. And one of the plugins will, for example, enable you to also spawn geometry based on where your mouse cursor is, like we are used to do it in 3D Max, if you are familiar with that. So there's a lot of plugins out there. It's absolutely amazing. The community of Blender is great. And this is something that I certainly love about Blender. Some of the vanilla tools might be a bit limited, but then we have the ability to look online for plugins. So long story short, let's take a look at these plugins that I find essential and that I want to show you in this tutorial. You will find the links in the description. So the first plugin we want to download is called QBlocker. And if you're not familiar with Gumroad, the way that it works is that some people put free stuff up on there, me included by the way, and then it's up to you whether you want to be generous and donate something to the creator, or let's say you're really tight on your budget, you can also get it for free by putting in a 0 here. And then you hit that purchase button and you will get to the download screen where then you want to grab the latest version here, which is 0.15. Just make sure to download all these plugins into one folder. It doesn't matter where that folder is located because we're gonna install it then later from Blender. The next plugin is called Cat Transform, which has some really nice snapping ability, which is also more close to how 3D Max does it. And it just improves the general way that snapping works in Blender. We're gonna take a look at that later in the tutorial. So same thing here, make sure to grab it. The next plugin is called Text Tools. And if you're familiar with 3D Max, chances are you have heard or you probably have Text Tools installed there. And I was happy to see that it also exists for Blender. Now, we probably won't be doing a lot of unwrapping here in this introduction to Blender video, but once you follow my free Blender Grenade tutorial, we will definitely be doing unwrapping there and also make use of text tools, as well as the next plugin which you want to download, which is called UV Squares. Just like text tools, UV Squares is a plugin that helps us unwrapping. Here on the creator's GitHub account, you can download it by clicking on code and then download that zip file. Alternatively, and if you feel generous, you want to go over here to the Blender Market And like I did, I purchased it here to support the creator who does a really amazing job creating these plugins. And this one here in particular was exactly what I was looking for. It's amazing. You're gonna see it once we get to the Grenade tutorial where we do the unwrapping. So the last plugin for now is Interactive Tools by Maxifs. He has a massive thread up here on Polycount that is worth reading, because in there you will find explanations for every one of these tools. He made some GIF graphics to make it really nice and easy to understand what does what. And it's a collection out of different tools. If you're coming from 3D Max, you will find a lot of them familiar, which once again is a great thing, because out of the box, Blender has its limits, and that's where the creators of these plugins step in to create amazing things to enrich the Blender experience. So once again, a plugin that is a must-have, and like the other ones, or many of the other ones, it is optional for you to decide whether you want to support this creator, which I highly recommend, or you can grab it for free here by punching in a 0. So one thing I want to point out though is that here at the bottom of the Polycount page, he posted the last version of Interactive Tools with a link to his GitHub account. I think when I checked, the version that was on Gumroad was actually not the latest, so make sure to grab it here from GitHub. Download zip. We are back to Blender. Let's go over to our preferences settings, and under add-ons we are then able to install these plugins we just downloaded. And as you can see, there's already a whole bunch of different plugins in here. Some of them are activated, others are not, but by default Blender already comes with a lot of plugins that are ready to be activated. So every once in a while the Blender Foundation looks at some really good plugins and decides to add them basically to the default setup file. If you download it, they already come with it. So there's a good chance that maybe some of these plugins we were just downloading eventually get added by Blender here to its core plugins that already come with it. But since that is not the case for the ones we just downloaded, we navigate over here to our download directory. And let's start here with the Maxifs tool, Interactive Tools. Let's double click that, and then you will see it automatically switches here to it. All that's left to do is enable it. And then if you take a look here on that button, you see that it now appeared here. Not all plugins have its extra window, but this one here in particular does have it. And as you can see, it has a whole bunch of different tools, and you can always hide that view if it's too much. But in general, it always makes sense to have it opened for whatever plugin you're currently using. So back to preferences. Let's install also the other plugins. Next one is QBlocker. Let's also activate it. QBlocker actually doesn't have its extra window. We're gonna access it in a different way. We're gonna see it in a moment. But let's carry on here. This one is the Cat Transform. Another amazing plugin for snapping. And then we have Text Tools. Let's activate it. And also UV Squares. So these last two, UV Squares and Text Tools, we're going to cover in the Grenade tutorial once we actually do unwrapping. So before we installed the plugins, we were looking at creating primitive geometry here in Blender, which by default always spawns in the center. So now that we have QBlocker installed, let's delete the one that we have here, that cylinder. So let me just collapse the sidebar so that you see better the shortcut actions that I'm doing. We access QBlocker by pressing Shift A, and that will give us the same menu that usually comes when we want to create some new solids. But now we have QBlocker up here as well. So let's go over and have a cylinder. You see on the left side, we already have an explanation that basically gives us the complete rundown on how to work with QBlocker. But in general, let's press down the left mouse button, and that will give us this basic shape here. And then if we let go of the left mouse button, we can then drag it out here. So this is how we can create an actual cylinder. And now if you look at the left side, it says that if we press H, it will convert it basically into a plane. So now if we drag the mouse up and down, you will see it stays that way. If we press H again, we're back to cylinder mode. So let's have this one here. Then let's drag another one here. As you can see right now, it's not uniform. So in order to have it as a uniform radius, we want to press Shift. And now it's a perfect cylinder here. Let's do that again. Press Shift. Another very useful thing with QBlocker is that we can spawn new solid geometry based on our normal orientation, indicated by wherever we have our mouse cursor. That is where we will spawn it. And let's say we want to have something here, or for example here. Makes it really nice and easy. But what if we want to have a cylinder with a certain amount of sides? So by default, it's 16. Now let's say we want to have a cylinder with 32 sides. What we do in that case is, while we have our selection active here, we press down the S key, and then you can just move the mouse to the left or the right side. So here we have 32 sides. Or we can also take that the other way, all the way down to 4, which basically makes it a cube. So this is how we can define how many sides we want to have. And then we confirm that by pressing down the left mouse button. So the other way of doing that, and actually the better way, is to create a cylinder, same thing, press down S, and then we use our mouse wheel for that. That way we don't have to worry to run out of monitor space. And same principle applies. We just define how many sides we want to have, and then we confirm with left mouse button. So whenever we are happy with what we created, we press the right mouse button, and that gets us out of the QBlocker mode. So let's take a look how to select things in Blender. Currently we have this cylinder here selected. If we press Shift, we can then add to that selection one by one here. And if you want to deselect something, you press Shift and you double click. Left double click. The only problem is that I found that, let's say I want to deselect that one, it doesn't recognize it because it basically looks at the object that's behind it. So let me try that. See, now it actually selected the other one. So in order to do that, it needs to be sort of out of the way. So now if I do it, it does it, if that makes sense. So same thing here. And now again, if I double click here while I press Shift, it won't let me do it. But if I press here, then it will actually do it. So this is a little bit strange, I must say. I would prefer if there's a different way where I can just press Alt to deselect, how I'm used to it in 3D Max. Maybe someone of you guys knows a way to do that, but it's still okay. This is just how it works, and it's not too big of a deal. So now everything is unselected. And then of course we have our selection box here, where we can then just select everything at once. So now if we want, we can move this selection around here with our move tool, which I think is pretty self-explanatory here, the gizmo, which lets us move things in X, Y, and Z. And if we select it here by this square, we can then move it Here in that case it would be on Z and on Y, and here we would move it on Y and on X, and so on. And of course Control Z, same as in most other software, will just undo the last step we did. So Control Z might be something that we want to increase actually, because by default I think it's set to 32. So I like to have that at 100. And another thing that I want to do while we're in the preferences is here under navigation, if we put on zoom to mouse position, it will then zoom in with the mouse wheel wherever we have the cursor. So I find that pretty nice. If we don't have that, then it will just take the center of our selection. I'm not actually sure if I want to have this on the whole time, but I'm gonna leave it on for now and see how I like it. So let's carry on with the tools that we have here. Rotating, it works the same way as moving things around. We will be able to make use of our gizmo here based on axis, or if we hold somewhere here in between the XYZ, we can do something like that, which you would rarely ever do really, because you want to be precise. And what you can also do is hold down Control to do these incremental steps of 5 degrees. You can always take a look here at the upper left. Let me just repeat that to see exactly the angle amount that you were rotating. And if you don't have Control, you just do it like that here freehand. I usually have Control on. Another thing that works for moving and rotating and scaling is that whenever we press Shift, it will slow down the action. So that way we can be extra precise. Let's try that here while we have the Move tool. So this is normal speed. Now we press Shift and that will just slow it down for us here. The same principles apply for our scaling. If we have the mouse within this white circle, we do a uniform scale. And then we can also do a scaling here based on X, Y, and Z by pressing on these buttons. And of course, we can also press Control and do this incremental scale stepping. And pretty much that is move, rotate, and scale. We have another tool here that combines all of these in one gizmo here. So you see we have the rotation here, we have the scaling. I personally find that a little bit cluttered, so I just stick to these three here. So in the meantime, since I started recording the tutorial, Blender 2.9 came out. You are probably already on that version if you follow the tutorial. But in my case, I'm gonna install it now and then switch over to this version and also quickly show you how to activate the plugins that we just installed for the previous Blender version. So as far as the plugins are concerned, we have to navigate over here to App Data, Roaming, Blender Foundation, and that's where you find subfolders for each installed version of Blender. So what we have to do is go into the previous folder for 2.8.3, and then all you want to do is copy over the scripts folder into the new one here. So let's just paste that in there. And that takes care of all the plugins that we previously installed. So I am back with Blender 2.9 and I will just reactivate these plugins and fast forward through this process. So let's continue to look at some of the plugins that we downloaded. The next one here is the cat transform. But in order to demonstrate that better, we also want to toggle our wireframe mode. because we're gonna snap in between edges and vertex points. And so far, we haven't actually activated the wireframe mode. You can do that by going over here and then enable wireframe. And now you see that this cube here actually shows us how many edges he has. And in order to make that a bit easier, we want to put that on a shortcut. So in Blender, you can always, wherever you have like one of these checkboxes, you can then right click on it and say assign shortcut. So now I'm going to press F4. But the problem is, if I press F4 now, I get the file context menu. So in order for this shortcut to be recognized, we have to go and get rid of this file context menu first. So let us go over here to our preferences under key map. And now we go over here to key binding and search for file context menu. Actually, we have to be here under name, file context. Let's see, there we go, file context. And you just want to uncheck that because you can see it's already assigned to F4. And unchecking that means that we made it clear, we deactivated here, and now we can go back over to our wireframe and change this shortcut here to F4. And now we actually have this toggle here on that key. So now let's take a look here at our cat transform plugin. By default, the snapping in Blender is pretty clunky, I would say, and I'm not even gonna go into it now, but this here is basically the best way to snap things together and pretty much provides the same usability that you're used to when you're coming from 3D Max. So in order to demonstrate that better, let's have a cylinder here next to that box. So now let's say we want to snap this box here to any of these vertex points here. First, we have to actually select the box, and then let's press N in order here to go into the configuration here for this cat transform. And it looks pretty overwhelming. It just means we have a whole bunch of different options with it, but all I ever need it for is the vertex snapping here. So I'm gonna press V, and now you have to also press G because we want to move this. So once you do that, you can see that wherever we have our mouse cursor, it indicates this here is the vertex point, where then we can snap it to something with. So let's hold down here, and then you can see now we're able to snap anywhere here to any vertex point on that cylinder. So then once we have it here in place, we just hit the left mouse button again, and that basically gets it done. So this is a very comfortable way of snapping, and that makes this plugin definitely worthwhile. So far we've been mostly in the object mode. The object mode is where we create new solid geometry for the most parts. And in the edit mode, once we press tab, we can then actually start working on these primitives that we added here to our scene. So let's go ahead here in our object mode. I'm gonna press A, select everything, and I just wanna clear out that scene. And I'm actually gonna create a new cube here, not with cube blocker. I just wanna have it here in the center, like this. So now let's head over here to our edit mode and right click, subdivide 2 times so that we have a bit more geometry here to work with to demonstrate some of these tools here. So by default, when we are in the edit mode, we are in the vertex selection mode. You can toggle by pressing 2, 3, and 1. And 2 gives us edge selection and 3 gives us face selection. Same as in 3D Max. So let's take a look here at our vertex selection. which allows us to select any of these points here, or pressing Shift to select multiple ones. Then we can move them and scale them and just work with it. Let's go over here to our edge selection. And let's say we want to have this whole loop here selected. Then all you have to do is press Alt and it will make this selection for you here. If you press Shift and Alt, you can select the ones that are next to it. It will add it to the selection. And clicking anywhere outside of that cube will deselect the current selection. So pressing Ctrl and Alt will give us this ring selection, and pressing Shift together with it will then also add to that selection. So that way we can select rings and loops here. Also, one thing to note is that let's say we have an edge loop selection like that, and then you go back to vertex mode, it will remember this selection and convert it here to vertex selection. Another thing that you might wonder where it is if you're coming from 3D Max is the element mode. In 3D Max we have an element mode which here we don't have like that, but you can have the same functionality by selecting any vertex point and then you press Ctrl and L. That will always select the current object in its entirety, and the same works if you do it with face or edge. So this is basically the element mode here in Blender. So even though this box is a bit boring, let's stick to it because it's perfect to demonstrate these different tools that we have. Let's say we want to delete this edge loop here and essentially get rid of the onboarding faces together with it. The way to do that is bringing up the delete dialog by pressing X, and then you want to go over here to dissolve edges. So this is basically the same as in 3D Max, where I think it is on Control and Backspace. And let's just undo that and see what happens if we go back here and then just say delete edges. What it does is that it only gets rid of the selection that we had, but it still keeps the edges that we didn't select together with the vertex points. So this is the difference. If we dissolve, it gets rid of everything, vertex points and the onboarding faces. And let's see how we can connect two vertex points with an edge. Let's press Shift to select both of them. And then if we press J, we make this connection here with an edge leading from this one to this one. And now let's undo that. Let's say we want to have a connection that goes all the way from here over to here. It will then cut an edge connection straight through it, which is pretty cool. So J is the button for that. So let's take a look how we would delete faces here on this cube. So first, let's go over here to our face mode. Let's select these 4 tiles here, and then we bring up that dialog again, and we need to then confirm that we actually want to delete the faces. If I undo that and I say dissolve faces, it will still remain that actual face here because it borders onto the other ones. And that's why in that case we have to tell it to actually really get rid of everything. So now let's do the same thing here at the bottom. And now let's say we go over here, select this edge and this one, and we want to connect that. In 3D Max it would be the bridge mode, and here it's the fill. We press F, and that way we fill that back up here. So the same thing works, of course, if we would just want to have this whole selection here. And that is how we do that in Blender. So if we delete geometry here, like this one, then we will see that our current object is showing as double-sided. And this can sometimes be a bit confusing because you don't really know what you're looking at. And in that case, I always prefer to enable backface culling, which you can do here under the viewport shading menu. And then once we have this enabled, we actually see that this is a hollow object and which way our actual geometry is facing. And that is where you can find that. So another frequently used action is to collapse something, and most of the time that would be a ring selection like this one here. So then we press M and we go over to collapse, and that way we have only one edge loop here instead of two. Same thing here, let's collapse that, and then if we want to get rid of that one, once again we would dissolve the edges, and that way you can quickly get rid of edge loops that you don't want to have in place. So let's say we want to do the opposite thing where we have this ring selection and now we want to have an edge loop going through the center. That would be a matter of right click and subdivide, and then we can do the same thing here once again. So this is how you add edge connections here. So let's go over and take a look how to target weld vertex points. In Blender, we need to go over here to our snapping dialog and then change it to vertex. Then you also want to actually enable the snapping. And here under options, we want to enable auto merge. You can set a threshold here. And then we are able to snap these vertex points here and target weld them. So instead of having to go through these two steps, we can also make use of these Maxifs tools plugin that we were downloading earlier. And in here we have a whole bunch of different actions. And one of them is target weld on or off. And you can see how it will basically just toggle on and off here our weld and snapping. So this is one of the cool things here with this plugin. And we can then also go ahead if we want and put it on a shortcut, or we can also have it on the quick favorites. So I'm gonna add it to the quick favorites, and right now this is under Q. So if I press the Q key, I get this quick favorite dialog, and it makes sense to add certain actions into these quick favorites that we use a lot. It's just a quick access. So my only problem now is that I don't really want to have quick favorites on the Q shortcut, because I want to put the selection box here on Q and also some of these here, so that it's basically mimicking what we have in 3D Max, where we have Q, W, E, and R for selection, moving, rotation, and scaling, because that is just the perfect hand position. If you look at your keyboard and you have the left hand there, and it's just very intuitive. And I prefer that over, for example, having the move on G. So I want to put it on Alt Q. So let's go over here to our preferences, and then under key map, quick favorites, and Alt Q. So now we can overwrite our selection box here, and I want to assign the Q shortcut here to it. So now when we press Q, we can make our selection box here. So next I want to assign W and ER, but there's a problem where I want to have E for rotate, but right now E is already reserved here by extrude region. So what we have to do is go over to our preferences, and then here let's see for extrude, this is the one, extrude and move on normals, and I actually want to have this put on D. Right now D is not really reserved for anything that I need, so I'm gonna have it here on extrude instead of E. So now I can put rotate on E, and I can have scale on R. So now we can comfortably cycle through here Q, W, E, and R, and that is pretty much what you're used to from 3D Max if you're coming from it. So the only thing that we still have to do is go back into our object mode, because in here we also have to reassign these shortcuts, because it looks at it as its own mode with its own shortcuts. So I'm gonna put this here also on Q, our selection box, and then let's put that on W here, our move. This here on E for rotate, and then we have R for our scaling. So let's create a new box here. I'm just going to use the standard cube that spawns in the center. Then I'm going to go over to our edit mode, and I want to subdivide that 2 times. So now let's switch over here to our face mode. And let's take a look at our extrude, which we have on the D shortcut now. So as you can see, we can extrude out new geometry here. And at the moment, we still have the snapping enabled because we were target welding. We can then toggle that on either by clicking on that symbol, or again, we can just toggle it here, the Maxifs plugin that we downloaded. So this is how we extrude in Blender. The way that it works is that it's looking at our normal orientation. So that means that, let's say we have a case like that here, and we extrude these faces. It will also follow the normal orientation. But now let's undo that. And let's say we want it to go this way. What we would do in that case is extrude, and then we hit the right mouse button, which will still perform the extrude action, but it snaps it back to its place here. And then we can drag it out like this. So whenever you extrude and hit the right mouse button, it will snap back, and then you can drag it out. So that would also be a good idea to look at how to align something. So let's say we want to have this here perfectly flat now on the x-axis. The way that we do that in Blender is by pressing S, X, and 0. That will align it. And the same works, of course, for the other axis as well. So in that case here, that would be the Z-axis. Let's just make that a bit more obvious. So let's say we want to have the whole thing here aligned on the Z-axis. We would make our selection, press S, Z, and 0. So this is not the most straightforward way, but this is just how it works in Blender. So sometimes it's actually the easier way to draw a selection. So something like that here, instead of having to individually select these faces, we can then also switch over to our vertex mode. And then with our Q shortcut, we can draw a selection. Actually, we don't even need to be in that mode here. We can also just be straight here in our move tool and also be able to draw a selection. So this works in all our modes here, even if we are on scale. But the Q shortcut here for our selection box means that it's not associated with any command that will actually change our position. So that is usually then the safest way, just to make a selection and be sure not to move anything. So now we can again press S, Z, and 0 to align it. So one important thing to look at with the selection is that, let's say we want to draw something like that here, then we would actually expect everything to be selected. However, this is not the case. As you can see here, it didn't affect these vertex points, which were hidden here behind this geometry. So the way that we do that in Blender is to toggle to the X-ray mode. We do that by pressing Alt and Z, and now if we draw a selection, we will affect everything that's back facing. So this is something that you have to get used to if you come from 3D Max, where we can decide whether we want to select everything with the back faces or not. Here in Blender, we have to always be in the X-ray mode for it to get affected. So what we can also do is grow a selection. Let's say we have only these points here selected. Then we can press Ctrl and plus and grow this selection. Ctrl and minus will undo that. and then we can, for example, delete these guys here and bridge it back together. Let's switch over to our face mode. Let's select that face here, and now let's take a look at inset. You press I, and then you can make an inset here into these faces, and if you press Control, you can determine the depth of it. And then if you let go of Control, it will lock it here into that position. If you press Control again, you can still make changes here, whether you want it to go up or down. So that is basically the inset here in a nutshell. And it makes sense to have the mouse cursor a bit further outside here to have more control over it. If I have the mouse cursor here, you can see that I have less room here to operate that. So I'm gonna undo that. And it makes more sense to be a bit more outside here to have this control. And also if we press Shift, like everything else in Blender, it will limit how fast we go. So it slows everything down a bit. So we can also access the inset here on that button, but in general shortcuts are faster. Let's take a look at the bevel, which is one of my favorite things here in Blender. Let's select these edges here. And then if we press Ctrl and B, we can decide how much of a bevel we want to have here. And if we use our mouse wheel, we can add segments to it. So this is pretty cool here in Blender and is a lot of fun. And in general, I would recommend you to just have some fun here with a box and just use these tools here, you know, drag them out, extrude them, go over here to the bevel and basically just try all these tools that we have. And that way you will be able to learn everything pretty fast. So as the next thing, let's take a look at our knife tool, which is over here, or we press K for knife. And this is essentially what in 3D Max we use as the cut tool. So you can see our cursor change to this knife, and if we draw it here anywhere over an edge, it will already indicate that it will snap to it. And the same goes here for the vertex points. So let's say we want to cut something like this here, some random shape, and then we come back here to another point. We still have to confirm it then by pressing Enter. So now that we did that, we have our vertex points drawn in here on that face. If we press the tilt key, the one that's under Escape, we get this nice menu here rolled out. So let's go to the top view, or you can press 8 on the numpad. And now let's say we want to slice through that whole object from here to over here. In 3D Max, we would use the slice plane, and here in Blender, we go back to our knife tool, and you click anywhere here, and then it already drags out our slice plane pretty much all the way. And then we want to confirm the point wherever we want it to slice through. And if you look at the bottom where we have this text, it says C to cut through. So let's press Z. And now let's confirm and hit Enter. And this is how we make a cut here through that whole object, the same as the slice plane in 3D Max. It might not be exactly the same, but this is the closest thing that we have to it in Blender. As the next thing, let's take a look at our edge constraint. And for that, I'm going to go over here to our edge mode. And I want to get rid of this corner here, basically, dissolve edges, so that we have this angle here. Now let's add an edge loop and let's select it. And what if we want this to stay in place here? For that, we have to enable our edge slide. So now we're able to just have it in place without affecting any of these positions here. And we can also access that by pressing GG. So that would be the shortcut for it. So let's get rid of this box here. I'm back in the object mode and I'm gonna create a new cube. And I also want to subdivide it 2 times. So now let's take a look at how to make instances and copies. And this is important to notice that we are in the edit mode right now because this behaves differently in the object mode. We can make copies here in the edit mode, and we do that by pressing Shift and D. So that will basically take whatever we have selected, and in that case we had the whole cube here selected, and it will make a copy of it. And if we want to have this in place and not something like that here, the same technique applies as before. We say Shift D and then we hit the right mouse button. It snaps back into place, and even though it looks like this is one object, it still has the copy selected. So if we copy something here in the edit mode, it will become the same element of which we took the copy from. So in that case here, these 2 cubes are actually the same element. If we want to detach that, we press the P key and then we say separate by selection. So now you can see we have actually 2 different elements here for it. And once we hit over here to our object mode, you will see that the pivot is still based on the original object where we made the copy from. And that would be another use case here for our interactive tools. We can then go over to Quick Origin, and it will then automatically center the pivot of our selection here. In that case, the whole cube. But we are also able to go back here to our edit mode. And for example, while we are in edge mode, we select this edge and we press Quick Origin, and it will then take the center of our selection. The same works here for our vertex mode. Once again, Quick Origin will now put the pivot right here. And that makes this Quick Origin a very essential button or shortcut pretty much. And I'm gonna put it here on our quick favorite bar. So now if we have Alt Q, we can then just hit Quick Origin and there's our new pivot point. For now, I'm gonna actually delete this box here. And let's remain in our object mode and see how copy and instances work here. So in the object mode, we are not able to select any individual vertex or edge, but it's always, like the name suggests, the overall object here. And then if we press Shift and D, it works the same as in our edit mode. We make a copy here. And as you can see, it automatically makes a new object out of it. Once again, if we are doing that in the edit mode, it will attach it to the current element, where here it's already coming as separated. So here we have our copies. And now let's see what the difference is if we make an instance. So we make an instance copy by pressing Alt and D. And it looks the same. If we press right mouse button, it snaps back, then we can drag it out. Let's make another one. And here we have our instances and here we have our copies. And if you are not familiar with instances, let's take a look at what it actually means. So let's go back to our edit mode. And by default, we are in the vertex selection, and you can already see that these 3 cubes here indicate that they can be edited. And because we have instances, you can see that wherever you make a selection, it also makes a selection here on our referenced objects. So that means that if we want to make a change here to that, let's for example make an inset, or let's make an extrusion, that it will apply this change to our referenced objects as well, while these two objects here are separate objects which won't get affected because we made them as copies and not as instances. Shift D for copies and Alt D for instances. So while we have this object here, let's go over to our edge mode and let's bevel this corner here. And now if we go over here to our object mode and we toggle the wireframe off, you can see that we don't have any smoothing group here on that. So in Blender, they don't call it smoothing group, and we also can't assign them individually. But the way that we can get some smoothing on here is by first of all selecting the object and then right click and say shade smooth. And by default, it will just basically apply one smoothing group on the whole object. And now it's up to us to go over here to our object data property. And under normal, we can then define an angle where it's supposed to start smoothing. So in 3D Max, the smoothing groups are very important for my workflow that I've shown in my previous tutorials. Here in Blender, we're gonna use bevel weights. We're gonna take a look at it in a moment. Another thing that we need to be in the object mode for is if we want to attach things together. So as you can see, we have 5 different objects here. And now let's say we want to attach these 3 here. What's important to pay attention to is in which order we select it, because the pivot point will always be taken from the last object. So let's select this one here with Shift and then this one, and let's press Ctrl and J. And now we have this as one object. And you can see the pivot point is the one from the last object that we selected. You can also see it because it's color coded. If we do the same thing over here, you will notice that this is now orange and the currently selected one is a bit of a brighter yellow. So now if we select that one, this here becomes the one with the bright yellow, and this indicates that this will be basically our pivoted object, and it will also then convert whatever settings this has on the rest of our object. So if we now Control and join that, it will then not have the auto smooth enabled, and let's see what happens. We then have to tell it to auto smooth again. So this is basically attaching in Blender. So let's assume we want to detach those elements here again into each individual object. Then we go back to edit mode, and while we have our current selection here, we can then press P and say separate by loose parts. So now if we go back to object mode, you can see that all these objects here are individual again, but the pivot point for each one of them is still assigned to the last object where we made the attachment to. So if we wanted to have the pivot point back in the center of, let's say, this one, we can then make use of our interactive tools again and going on the quick origin. So even though we talked about detaching stuff before, I want to make another example here out of having one object. And what if we want to detach, let's say, that piece here and make it a separate object? Then we would go over here to our face mode and we would grow that selection and press P and say separate by selection. So now you can see that we have a new cube here as a new object, and basically that is how we would split that up if it's already one element before. So another thing that we could take a look at while we have all these different objects is the isolation mode, which you can find on the slash key. It will then also do a bit of a zoom and basically hide everything else. So this is the isolation mode in Blender. So while we have several objects here in the scene, let's take a look at the material editor. The way that this works in Blender is that each one of these objects here has its own material properties. And essentially that is our material editor here. So let's say we want to have a color here on that one. We then go over here and say add material slot, and then we say new material. So now this material slot has its first material, which by default is gray and doesn't even show. But now we actually confirmed that we have a material here, and let's call it red. So now we go over here, assign a color, and then we have to go over to our edit mode, press A to select our current object, and then we say assign. So now the reason why nothing shows is because we still have to go over here on viewport shading. If we go here on that arrow, we can also put scene lights on, and we are even able to change the direction of the sun. If you take a look here at the shadow. So now let's say we want to have only a segment here with a different color. First of all, we have to be in the face mode, and let's just click outside to deselect. If we press Alt and then make a left mouse click, we can automatically select the whole loop here. If we press Alt and click in the center, it makes it vertically. So let's do it here at the side so that we have this horizontal selection, and then let's create a new slot, new material, and let's just call it green and assign it, and there it is. So one thing that left me wondering when I learned Blender is, if I now go here onto a different object and I go on the material editor, I don't see these materials that we just set up for this one. So in order to reuse materials that we already created, we want to remain here first in that one and make sure that we created the materials that we want to use. So I'm just going to go ahead here and make a blue one. Let's also give that a proper name. And then let's create a yellow one as well, just to demonstrate that better. So now let's say we want to assign these colors, these materials here, to any of these objects. We then make our selection. With Shift we can again select multiple ones, and I'm gonna select these 4 here. I'm not gonna select that one. Remember, that is its own object that we detached earlier. And then most importantly, with Shift we select that one here as the last one, which then automatically becomes our active selection with this material here. And we can then press Ctrl and L and say make links to materials. So now what is important to remember is that this is our current active selection, which consists out of these 5 cubes here. Well, these really can't be called cubes anymore, but whatever. That means that with that selection, if we go back to the edit mode and we are here in the face mode or really any mode, we are able to select all of them here. Now let's press L, and then we can make an easy selection here and assign it with whatever color we want. So this one here, let's make it blue. And then remember, this cube here doesn't actually have this material yet. So all of these have it, but this one we left out. And if we wanted to assign it, we would then just again select this, or we could also use any of these here because they also have it. Press Ctrl L and say materials. So this is how that works here in Blender with the material editor.